Hello. Aggregates of stardust and legacy of hydrogen. What a journey we've been on together. From yesterday's fascinating musing on planetary consciousness and its technosphere, all the way to landing on Earth. Thank you, Nathan. On planetary realism this morning. I am here to provide a simple bridge between a fascinating and complex conversation this morning on planetary governance to our next conversation, which surely will be as fascinating. And in order to do this, well, being a good old international relations scholar, nobody's perfect, I would like to suggest a very simple bridge, which I thought I would call the stubbornness of power. And to illustrate this bridge, let me propose 3 premises to you. Having listened to everything that was said, I think clearly the first premise I would call subversion. Is there any doubt that we in this room, well, hard to say subversion here, but nevertheless, our challenge is to subvert an existing order. That is what planetary governance is all about. Because it has many enemies that I suggest are more powerful than its advocates. We talked about capitalism earlier. Well, extractive capitalism is that which we're after. Probably not everything. And greed and nepotism and corruption sustain a system that is so powerful that we need stubbornly to defend. Young protesters around the world, from here to Uganda, all the way to indigenous tribes who vote in Ecuador and Colombia to keep in the ground oil that would make them rich. So how do we do this? How do we subvert? And of course, we talked a lot about the power of imagination, since we're talking about the stubbornness of power. I would like to propose an amendment to the metaphors that we've been playing with. And that is that we talked a lot about translocalism. Yes, translocal solidarity between struggles for planetary governance. Can we not think that this concept of planetary subsidiarity, which Niels and Jonathan play with in their wonderful book, or what I would call polycentric subsidiarity networks, etc., is best illustrated by the image of the rhizome. You know, this fabric connecting all the roots underground in huge ecosystem. And what is it about the rhizome? It's not just the roots, but it is all-powerful and yet invisible. And perhaps we too need, for at least a while, to stay maybe a bit invisible. It's hard for our egos, but it makes the powerful less attuned. Maybe it gives us hope that they won't quite see what's happening to their power. Which leads me to my second premise. And the second premise, well, the buzzword, we heard it this morning from Nicolaidis and others, is democracy. But the premise is that planetary governments must be owned by us, as far as possible, by us, Spinoza's multitude. I'm thinking, and do we still have the wonderful show of waves here? I'm thinking of Dawn's planetary constituents. Yes, they must be empowered, but they're ripples. And the question is, how do we make them powerfully contagious through the kinds of coalitions and all sorts of assemblage, which we talked about this morning? So if that is the case, if we care about democracy, how do we deal with the fact that Gen Z in the name of who? Their and their kids, we are speaking, we're acting, we want to change the world. Well, almost half of them believe that, eco-autocracy, eco-fascism almost, will do a better job for planetary governance, for what they yearn for their shared purpose. How do we start saying that the lethal fusion between surveillance capitalism, the surveillance state, and surveillance governments increasingly will only continue to sustain extractive capitalism? Well, this is by praising and enacting the premise of democracy, or rather, there's no such thing as the pure democracy. Democratic practices, as Robert Dow would say. And so to the panel this morning, I would say, and here I have taken all my notes, yeah, delegation, yes, but with possible recall by us, as Machiavelli would say. Foresight and long-term thinking, yes, of course. But let's democratize these foresight games that we play. The scenarios are for all, from schools to neighborhood to the workplace. Democratize foresight. Rule of law, yes. But let's demand everywhere the radicality of sunlight, not just on our rooftop, but in the corridors of power. Transparency is not a small thing. Holding governments to account, yes, of course, but can we invent much more horizontal ways to do it? Creating pairs of countries whose people hold each other to account when we talk about the COPs? Global Citizens Assembly, yes, yes, of course, but shall we not start with transnational assemblies everywhere, as I have had the luck of doing with our European Transnational Assembly that we have called the Democratic Odyssey, with Nicolo and other Lorenzo and other friends in the room, supported by Berguren, which has indeed been about a laboratory. And when we speak about transnational odysseys around the world, transnational assemblies, participatory budgeting, we know that they serve a climate purpose, a nature, for nature purpose. Research has showed it again and again. Yes, Europe can be a laboratory, which means it fails more often than it succeeds. We're not a kind of standards of civilization model at all. And finally, let me say a point on, of course, democracy is about expanding the franchise, increase inclusiveness over time in the last 200 years. And we heard Jonathan yesterday mention the inspiring work he's doing on an interspecies constitution. Yes, that is the extent and the expanse of democracy that we're looking for. But let me add to this exploration, Jonathan, the idea that perhaps planetary governance is about translation. It's about translation between worlds. Yes, it's about translating the language of whales. Yes, it's about translating the sense of the gaze of the last elephant in a dying species. It's about all of these translations. And now, given that my time is up, let me give you the last buzzword, and you won't be surprised. Last buzzword is justice. We heard Frank and many others in the room speak about justice. The first thing we say when we start speaking, it's not fair. The story is about fairness. And what I would like to add to this debate is that when you look at the history of multilateral governance, what we have inherited, what we're playing with, the rules of the game, every regime in the international system is about assigning to the more vulnerable the answer to who adjusts. It's non-nuclear state, not nuclear state. It's debitors, not creditors. It's migration country, not the emigrant country. It's carbon emitters, not carbon consumers. It's indeed the non-humans, not the humans. So let's remember those patterns of injustice that connect all of the rules of the game in the international system. And let's invent a new way to reassign the burden of who adjusts to crisis and transformations in the world. Now, with these three premises, subversion, democracy, and justice, fairness, I would like simply to leave you with one thought. What if we could take our kids in every school as of the age of 5, 6, 7, and convey to them the idea of quantum consciousness, that in this room, All of our brains and neurons are connected because we're thinking together. And therefore, how not to cooperate? And if they kind of learn to internalize this idea of who they are and the togetherness, perhaps, just perhaps, maybe, there is hope for advancing in the world the radical subversion, democracy, and justice that we need to embody planetary governance. Thank you.